On the first half, we're up against the Fontaine world boss, Capellia and Capellius. Specifically, this is the Capellia version, so she will be our main target for this fight, while Capellius will be supporting her with all kinds of different attacks. From the get-go, it's worth mentioning that this boss has 70% cryo and animo res, so I highly recommend avoiding teams that deal primarily cryo or animo damage on this half. Aside from that, there really aren't any elemental restrictions for what you can use on this half. For this run, I'm using a traditional national team, which is of course really good for single target bosses like this. There actually aren't too many mechanics to discuss in this fight. Capellia will stay in the middle of the arena the entire time, so obviously positioning is not really a problem here, except maybe to keep Capellius in your field of view to help dodge some of his attacks. One thing that is worth mentioning is that Capellia periodically receives a 25% res buff throughout this fight, which isn't very apparent. You can remove this res buff by hitting her with a Numa aligned attack, and if you hit her with 3 Numa aligned attacks, you can actually stun her. If you're having a hard time incorporating these Fontaine characters into your team, or you just don't have them, you can also use the Nazizenkreuz sword that you get from the Fontaine World Quest. Just make sure it is Numa aligned before you enter the Spiral Abyss. Even if you don't have enough Numa aligned characters to stun her, being able to remove that res buff every now and then does help to give you a slightly faster clear. Aside from this, the main issue for me in this fight was actually survivability. The two of them combined deal a pretty substantial amount of damage, so you do need a good amount of sustain to keep your team healthy. Most of my clears on this half were with teams that had Bennett or Kokomi on them, which of course are some of the best healers in the game. Speaking of team comms, national teams work really well here like I mentioned before. Both traditional national and the child variation are good options here. As usual, Hyper Bloom is another great choice against single target bosses like this. Nahida, Xingqiu, Kuki, just a really strong core composition. For the flex slot, I prefer to take another healer like Yao Yao or Kokomi to help with that survivability like I mentioned earlier. This one isn't so obvious for this chamber specifically, but because of the previous chambers leading up to this one, teams that deal primarily hydro damage are also comfortable on this half. Neuvillette, obviously a very strong hydro carry, also happens to have a Numa alignment, so he also ends up applying that res debuff periodically. If you do have Neuvillette, you definitely want to put him on this half. He just very naturally counters most of the enemies you see on this side. On the second half, we're up against the automated supercomputing field generator verified type R001. The main mechanic with this boss is that it starts with and periodically generates a Geo shield, which you first have to break before you can deal any substantial damage to it. In exchange, the gravity in the arena is decreased, so you're able to plunge attack with any character, which gives you more options to break the shield. The Geo shield is 20 gauge units, which can be broken with about 10 sword plunge attacks or 6 claymore plunge attacks. When you are doing your plunge attacks, try to perform one normal attack right before you jump. This allows you to sneak in an extra attack while cancelling most of the normal attack animation, which really speeds up the process. Here I'm using Noelle as my designated shield breaker. Since she is a claymore user who also uses geo-infused attacks, she's able to break the shield a little bit faster. The rest of the team is just a regular Hyper Bloom composition, which is again really good for dealing single target damage. After you break the Geo shield, you have about a 20-second window to deal damage before the shield regenerates and you restart the rotation. Again, positioning is not really a concern in this fight since the boss is basically stationary. The only mechanic I want to mention is that this boss can also be stunned with a Numa aligned attack. The stun ends up extending its vulnerability window by around 5 to 10 seconds depending on when you stun it. Taking advantage of this mechanic is really helpful not only because it helps with survivability, but also basically guarantees that you can get your combo off before it regenerates the shield. What I usually like to do is after I break the Geo shield, I set up my buffs and off-field abilities first, and then right before my on-field carry comes on, I use the Numa aligned attack to stun the boss. And this guarantees that my carry has enough time to deal all of their DPS before the boss wakes up and enters the next shield phase. You can absolutely beat this half without using any Numa attacks, but if you feel like your rotations are running a little too long or you're having trouble staying alive against the boss's attacks, definitely consider incorporating this into your team because it should help with those things. Each of these rotations of breaking the shield and dealing damage lasts about 30 to 40 seconds. Depending on how fast you clear the first half, you usually get about 3 or 3.5 of these rotation cycles in this fight. So as a DPS check, you should be aiming to deal about a third of the boss's HP with each shield cycle. Looking at some other team comps that work on this half, obviously Zhongli is really useful here since his hold skill consumes 8 gauge units from the Geo shield. Combined with his burst, you're able to break the shield with just 1 or 2 more plunge attacks. Because of this, really any team that naturally incorporates Zhongli as part of it should be able to clear this half pretty comfortably. Hu Tao teams, Hyper Bloom teams, Navia teams, and Mono Geo teams are just a few examples that all work. If you don't have Don't Li, Raiden National is also a pretty good option here. Even though it doesn't have a Claymore character in it, you can supplement your plunge attacks with overloaded reactions using a combination of Raiden and Xiangling's skills, and overloaded does count as a heavy attack, so it will chip away at the Geo shield a bit faster. Once that shield is down, the single target damage that Raiden National outputs is obviously just absurd, so even if the shield breaking takes a little bit longer, you can make up for it with more damage dealt during the vulnerability window. One last team that I wanted to share just because I was very happy to find that it actually works is this Mono Pyro Deha team. One thing that I liked about this team a lot is that it doesn't take away Xingqiu from the first half, who is a key piece for a lot of the comps that work on that side as well. So being able to run this team on the second half gave me a bit more flexibility in the different setups that I could use. These are all the tips I have for this chamber. I hope it helped give you some more ideas for how to tackle it. The builds for all the characters I used in this video will follow shortly, and as always, thank you so much for watching.